can you be self-sufficient? What I mean is completely off-grid, all by yourself, stand alone, and able to be completely independent. I'm Justin Hitt with Prosperity Homestead. Now I'm going to give you a quick answer, and then I'm going to give you the longer answer. While individuals desire to be independent, off the grid, stand alone, they want to have full control over their future, there has never been a point in human society where that was possible. Even the mountain men of the pioneer days, the mountain men that wandered the mountains, trapping and fishing, they had to have customers to deliver their product to. Now that allowed them to buy provisions, because things like rifles and all the little details of their life could not be readily manufactured in the wood. Now they could make by, and they could as a pioneer build shelters and things like that. But once they started, they had a shelter or a cabin, and they started being isolated in one location, it became even more difficult for them to survive without some kind of outside resource. So if you study anthropology and you look at hunters and gatherers, they tended to work in teams or small groups, tribes. As the hunter and gatherers settled into cities, there started to become a specialization of activity and services. And then as we move towards what we would consider the modern times, I would argue that there's been modern times many times before now, but ultimately as we're more codependent on each other, we have to use other people's specialties to go beyond our basic everyday needs. So a lot of the times people want to go off grid or they want to be independent. There's been some kind of dramatic life change or event. So maybe they've had a messy divorce. Maybe they've had economic downturn, and they think in their brain that if we are completely independent, that this kind of bad thing is not going to happen again. If we go off grid and we just get away from society, that things are going to be better, and I'm not going to be impacted by the dumb things everybody else is doing. Now, there's some truth to that. But if you go off and you're doing your podcast on living off grid, you're going to need a lot of modern technologies to come with you initially that are not available otherwise. So there are people today living in situations where they are completely dependent on their own efforts. They have to have multiple skill sets. They've got to have a lot of ability to defend themselves, because there's constant struggle, constant, I don't want to say invasion, but one example I have in mind is the Congo. In the Congo, there's a lot of, because they've had government instability, because they've had a lot of challenges, there's a lot of individuals who've got to figure it out on their own. They've got to build their own shelter. They've got to find their own food. But even in that environment, in small communities, people are thriving because they found ways to cooperate with each other. So it is popular to play on the desire to be independent and not a slave to society, to become a minimalist or downsize. I've really, in my life, have looked at how monks live, how those who are studying religion live, and how that's how the Amish and how people in those types of communities live. But again, it is always a community. So the short answer to going off grid, blazing your own trail, it's not realistic. It's not impossible, but it's not realistic, because you will have to have some interaction with other people. Now, if you're on the run and you're going to hide in the woods because you are, wanted by the law, then yes, you could be independent, but you're, again, going to be in constant fear. You still rely on the waste of society, so people, throwing out things. You're reliant on that. You're a scavenger in a sense. But ultimately, you will be happier in some kind of community. Now, I advocate parallel society, parallel communities. So if you decide you want to live without electricity and you want to live without certain things and spend the majority of your time praising the Lord and focusing on your religious aspect while you're eking out a living, growing your own food and raising your own animals, fortunately, the United States allows you to do that. Now, there's a lot of other countries around the world that allows you to do that as well, but it's going to be more enjoyable and more long-term sustainable if you do that within a community. Now, that's not what I'm advocating, because ultimately it's really up to you what you do. If you want to go off grid, you've got to find a community. Even though you are going to be in your little home, all throughout human history, there has been some kind of human interaction. So, for example, a lot of the folks in the Appalachian Mountain, their homes are very far apart, but they still send letters to each other, and they have some kind of church service or community function that periodically brings people together. So if in your mind you're dreaming about Anne of Green Gables or Little House on the Prairie, do watch the shows again and understand that they're not doing this in a vacuum. Now, the reason why they're not doing this in a vacuum is because when you have your specialty and someone else has their specialty, and you're in a small village environment, for example, you're able to benefit from each other's outputs or surplus. What you'll find in an environment where you're all alone and you've bugged out and you're raising your own food and you're eating MREs and you're living off grid, is that there will become a point where you're either going to have a surplus of materials or you're going to have a famine of materials. You won't have the stability that comes that if it was 2 or 3 families that bugged out together. And I'm just giving you these extreme examples because these extremes is what sells you into training programs, survival courses, and all these other things that are valuable. But if the mindset is, I'm going to do it all alone, it actually is mentally detrimental to you. So if you don't like the greater society, you don't like the world around you, you again can create your own society. You can create your own niche. I hear a lot of people talk about these conspiracies of the Bilderberg Group and all these other, organizations, the Illuminati. The only difference between you and the Illuminati is the Illuminati, as we are perceiving them or as we're creating them, whether they exist or not, is evidently well organized, and so well organized that it can pull the strings of society to get its way. Well, why not in your own household be organized? We talk about pantry management, about meal planning. We talk about growing our garden deliberately rather than just whatever vegetables we think are cool. We talk about self-education and learning additional materials. Again, you can't self-educate because if you don't know how to do something, you'll have to do a lot of trial and error to figure out what works and what doesn't. So you buy a book. The book will teach you. And now you're in a community with those who have bought the book. And you can learn even faster is if you find it, you pass the book around to your friends, and then you, in practice, work together to grow something. Now, what I'm not talking about here is a socialism where you are redistributing wealth. It is perfectly fine if you have your own homestead that has its base provisions, and then you only trade your surplus. That's fine. But you need the freedom to be able to do that, and that freedom comes with having a small structure around that. So the township, the village, the fraternal organization, the church organization, the civics organization. And now what I'm getting to here is that desire for independence gets shortcutted if you go out on your own and turns into paranoia. It turns into a feast and famine cycle. It turns into a lot of struggle, a lot of concern. But if you instead say, look, I want to be independent, who else wants to be independent? And you make sure your neighbors are taken care of. You make sure your property, your animals, your food, everything is taken care of. And then you start looking at your neighbors and saying, look, I have a surplus of chicken eggs. Are you interested in chicken eggs? You start building this free market. You'll very often find that you can work in your specialty and they can work in their specialty, and together you have a much more enjoyable experience. That's why it's so valuable to have family around you. If you don't have family around you, to at least make an effort to communicate with family. It's so important for you to know your neighbors. It's so important to look out for your neighbors now, even before you have a need. And why we teach more of the pillar of the community concept, the estate concept, or the concept of building your own alternative community. Now, again, It depends on the whims of society, whether your community is alternative or if it's mainstream. Very often folks who want independence, who want to be free from the government intervention, who want things to be fairly implemented, the freedom to trade and distribute their goods and services, the ability to set for self-defense, free speech, all that is something that is not in the mainstream narrative today. And if you want to change that, it's not a change that happens outside. It's a change that happens in your household. It means equipping your children with skills and work ethic so that they do well in whatever society they enter. It's making sure that your home is well equipped and fitted and is appropriate sized for what you're doing. A lot of folks will go out there and overbuild, and then they find it's difficult to maintain, and then they end up having frustrations around that area where they spend all their time working on the homestead. You need to make sure that you have base provisions and you know where to get base provisions, and you don't have to go get it from the Walmarts, and you don't have to go buy it on Amazon. You can figure out a way within your community to get the things that you need, and to also make sure your neighbors get the things that they need. And again, that's where you look at, we went from hunters and gatherers, and it seems desirable to do that, but you may want to build the stability of what they call a three-legged stool. So if you have one leg on a stool, it doesn't stand up on its own. If you have four legs on a stool, it can get wobbly because the legs can get uneven links, but a stool of three legs tends to be more stable. And so what is that? It's yourself, making sure that you're strong and able, and you have a base skill set that has value in some kind of marketplace or community, to make sure your family's taken care of, to make sure you're teaching your children well, and you're bringing them up in good, right, and well accepted within your community behaviors. So I don't want to say an indoctrination, but I'm saying that you make them capable, or you help them be capable to make good decisions. And then finally, the third leg is that immediate community. If you and your neighbors are taken care of by mutual benefit, then you don't have to worry about somebody coming in from the outside. Everybody's going to be mindful and aware and able to do the basics. Now, if you start trading with the community down the street, it is possible the community down the street might have better resources. They might have better tools, and you can learn from them by training education. You can let them push their specialties, their areas of joy, their areas of skill, and you can trade out that way. And then you ultimately progress and work together for mutual benefit. So again, if you look at many of these intentional communities out there, they have a high level of stability over time when they work as a community rather than a cluster of individuals. When you look at individuals who have been by themselves for long periods of time, so for example, interviews with elder monks who have taken a vow of silence and who have ultimately stayed away from society, it has some mental challenges. It has some detrimental challenges, and that's why religious systems tend to have festivals, and they tend to have services, and they tend to have at least written forms of communications. And then when you look at the practical nature of being independent, being completely off-grid, being all by yourself, you're not going to be able to manufacture the solar panels by yourself. Unless you have no electricity, you're going to have to rely on some kind of provision in order to maintain this off-grid lifestyle. So it's almost an oxymoron to say, hey, I'm off-grid, I'm independent of the system, I'm outside the system. That all might feel interesting, but it's not real, because what you're describing as a system is the world we live in. And even it just gets me sometimes when people say, well, you know what, I'd love to do this, but the Rockefellers are keeping me. All they did was organize their system and then teach their beliefs and then advocate what they want. You just go do the same thing, and then it doesn't matter what the neighbors are doing. If you're doing what's right, if you're doing what's good, and you start interacting with people and building that community, then eventually the community will turn, because you'll get to what's called a tipping point. And that's why we have predominant religions. You may not be aware, but there's like thousands and thousands of religions. I just make religious study a part of my habit, part of my mental development. And I'm studying behavior and the things that I enjoy as far as the outdoors and gardening. But ultimately, none of this is done on our own. You can't even grow seeds. If you've got heirloom seeds, you can't grow those seeds over a certain number of generations and still get the original vegetables. Even heirloom seeds, plants that are true to seed, can have cross-pollination challenges. And so you've got to trade those seeds with people on the other side of town. And you've got to trade the seeds. So if you have to do that for the health of the plant and the nutritional value of the plant, then why not make it fun? Why not start a farmer's market? Why not start a seed exchange? Why not get a knitting circle? My mom participated a lot in quilters' bees, and it was a great experience for her. And they would quilt, and they'd have fun, and they'd get together, and they'd have little get-togethers and things. And I like potlucks, for example. Please step away from the mindset of being completely off-grid. It increases your respect for fellow men and women. It increases your ability to get the resources you need, because there's a lot of resources that you don't know that you need, and then suddenly you need them. It helps shorten the learning curve, and it ultimately gives you more freedom because you're within a group of like-minded individuals. Please understand that real freedom comes in a tight-knit group of capable individuals who are mindful of the situation, yet don't let it distract them, and that ultimately build their own path. You don't have to become Amish. You don't have to become Mennonite. You don't have to join some secret organization. You don't have to be a part of the right community. You can be a part of your community and start building out from there and be cooperative with even communities you don't completely agree with, because in the long run, it's really about living a good life. It's about providing for your family and children. It's about providing for those who can't provide for themselves. It's about building in a organization where you have an internal locus of control, meaning you've built up your own skills and strengths so that you are useful, rather than what the modern society tends to do, is which advocate those skills to some kind of central government or some kind of central organization. So I'm not talking about socialism at scale. I'm talking about a free market community that takes care of its own concerns and needs, that looks out for its own rights and freedoms, that neighbors are helping neighbors. And many times this is attributed to small rural communities, but it doesn't have to be that way. There are cities where a block will get together and take care of their needs. And so it doesn't matter if you're urban, whether you're rural, or whether you're in a developing world. People who tend to work together, starting first with themselves, making sure they got their stuff straight, and then their family, making sure their family members are straight and taken care of, then their immediate neighbors, and then their community, tend not to have the problems that most people worry about. I'm Justin Hitt with Prosperity Homestead, and we've been talking about that long-term development of a homestead. And it really is as much off the farm as it is on the farm. And it's really about that cooperation and those relationships that make this enjoyable, that make this sustainable, and make your homestead prosperous. I'll see you in the next podcast. I tend to do these podcasts every week or two. And wherever you're subscribed to the podcast, it's great. We welcome you. We thank you. But if you ever have any questions, visit me at www.prosperitymomestead.org. You can go to the contact page and ask your question. We have a free newsletter. We have a lot of resources there. I'd love to hear from you, because your questions are the basis or the guide for what we deliver as far as content is concerned. Thanks for listening, and I'll see you in the next episode.